Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so we are here, right? The NBA draft has passed, and there is a lot to talk about and a number of things that happened. We'll get into some of the picks. We're not going to go over every single player that got drafted, but I think we're going to go over a lot of the highlights in the first and some of the second round, what we liked, what we didn't like. Obviously, we knew what was going to happen with the first two picks, right? With Cooper Flagg going to Dallas, Dylan Harper going to the Spurs. We knew both of those guys were going to be 1 and 2, respectively. We know that both of those guys are going to fit in with those teams. Think they're going to play really well and contribute right away. They got some really solid skill sets that both of these teams could use. For Dallas, we'll see what the roster looks like as they, kind of are in a middle part where it's like you have veterans like AD, you're waiting for Kyrie to come back, still have Clay, they re-signed Gafford, but then you also have this new guy, Cooper Flagg, coming in, right? If he can be really good right away, that could change Dallas's fortunes. Still probably wouldn't be a championship level team necessarily, but they'd probably be a good team in the Western Conference. And then for the Spurs with Dylan Harper, another guard to fit into the rotation. We'll see how that works with him and Fox and Castle. Will all three of those guys be their guards long term with Wemby and their other guys that they took? And then number 3, right? It was kind of reported that the Sixers were leaning towards VJ Edgecombe. That's what happened. They ended up taking him as a good athletic, defensive-minded guard, right? So now you have assuming they bring back Quentin Grimes, and you got Maxey, you got Jared McCain, who was really good before he tore his meniscus. Then you have Edgecombe, and you also have Quentin Grimes. So that's a solid backcourt, multiple guards that can do different things. We don't know how healthy the Sixers will be, right? Because obviously if Embiid can't stay healthy, which seemingly has just been the case for a while, then they're probably not going to be that good anyways, but that's still a good pick.
Mm-hmm.
Then once we got to 4 was kind of where you weren't sure what direction things were going to go, right? Charlotte took Con Kneppel. I believe they had 3 picks in the draft, right? Because they took him, they took Liam McNeely towards the end of the first round, and then they also took a center out of Creighton, Ryan Kalkbrenner, right? So all of those picks seem like solid picks. They also traded Mark Williams to Phoenix for the 29th pick and a future first. So they traded Mark Williams, and they also traded Nick Richards earlier in the year, right? So they traded both of their bigs to Phoenix. And then I guess we'll see what happens with Kalkbrenner. I guess Nurkic is on the roster right now. Is he the starting center? Is it somebody else? I don't know. But the big one was Ace Bailey, right? Because he was generally mocked as one of the top 3 prospects, and he fell in the draft, right? A lot of people thought he might fall to Washington at 6. But he actually ended up falling to 5 with Utah, and that was a place where he seemingly did not want to go to. But Danny Ainge and the Jazz took him anyways, right? And he's the most polarizing pick in the draft because everybody recognizes he's got great physicals, gifts. He's got a real talent for scoring the basketball. But, can the other parts of the game come to him, right? Like, can you see him use that athleticism for maybe playmaking and attacking off the dribble? Can he translate some of that into defense, right? He's got length, he's got size. So we'll see what happens. We know his camp tried to kind of get him into different spots. Again, Washington, that would probably be a team where the structure is different because there's no Lauri Markkanen on Washington, right? There's not like a clear guy where you're like, yeah, this is probably our number 1 offensive player, right? He would probably be able to take as many shots as he would want to in Washington.
Yeah.
But, that's not the case. So with Utah, it's a talented guy. So if the talent is there and it shows itself, then that's a really good pick, right? They also traded for Walter Clayton Jr., right, from Florida, right? One of the college heroes in the tournament. So they got a couple of good picks. So I think there's a lot to like about that. Then the Wizards took Trey Johnson. He ended up falling if you want to consider it that, to 6, right? You're the Wizards guy. So I guess you can talk about him and kind of share your thoughts about how you feel about the pick.
It's amazing. I think it's for sure one of the best steals, I think, of the draft, right? Like, this is a top 4 talent. I think most people had him, mocked above probably like a guy like Con Knipple, even Ace Bailey at times, right? So I think them getting him at 6, like you talked about him falling in quotes, is amazing. Best case scenario, right? And the Wizards just traded away Jordan Poole, right? So they were kind of losing a little bit of offensive firepower, but I think you're gaining that in Trey Johnson, right? In college, the guy played in one of the toughest conferences, SEC, led it in scoring, and not just bad shots, right? Like this is very efficient, tough shot maker, and arguably the best knockdown shooter in this draft, and that's something that Washington desperately needs. Is a sense of consistency, a shot creator, and yeah, I think you love it. And he also has a lot of playmaking upside, so I think it's great. And I know there were rumors that Washington wanted to trade up to number 4 to snag Ace Bailey before Utah could. But Charlotte was hesitant because they didn't want to lose their guy, Con Knipple. So it is kind of interesting to hear the process and the thought process of some of these teams, in terms of who they're going after, right? So I think Trey Johnson, he might not have been the number 1, guy that they were looking for in this draft, but it's certainly the best consolation prize. Like, you can't be mad at it. I think you would grade Ace Bailey and Trey Johnson the same, if Ace Bailey went to Washington. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Exactly. And that's kind of how you look at it. So, I would say most of the top 6 teams, right? I think you got to feel good about the guy that you selected, right? And then moving on to, I guess, the latter part of the lottery, right? This is where it starts to get a little bit questionable just for a couple of teams, right? So, for the Hornets, the Pelicans, they ended up taking Jeremiah Fears, right? Kind of a small guard, didn't really shoot that well in college, right? But also, has handle, some playmaking ability. The issue, I think, is that, yeah, on paper, right? If the shot's there, potentially, then that could be a decent fit, right? As like a ball handling, passing, playmaking guard next to guys like Zion, guys like Trey Murphy, and Nisi and some of these other guys. It could work. They also took Derek Queen in the lottery as well. But the only issue with that was they ended up trading their 2026 first round pick unprotected to the Hawks, right? And they used that to take, I believe it was what's his name? The other guy, right? Asa Newell.
Yeah, Asa
They ended
Newell,
up taking him. Yeah, they ended up taking Asa Newell because so basically the Hawks moved down like 10 spots, and that just seems to me a little bit odd if you're New Orleans. I don't know if it makes a whole lot of sense to give up an unprotected first just to trade up to get a guy. Now again, I think a lot of people, ourselves included, like Derek Queen, right? He's got some solid offensive skills, right? You've kind of mentioned he's feels kind of similar to like an Alperen Şengün, but then you do have some issues in terms of like people have questioned his motor, his defense, at least especially consistency wise.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like it's a lack of awareness, but it does feel like it's him just kind of maybe that ties into the conditioning where he's not playing as hard on the defensive
he's a
end.
big guy, right? Like,
Right.
look at his
Yeah.
frame. He's very similar to a Jokic in terms of his frame, right?
Yeah.
A younger Jokic, I would say. And, Jokic is not a defender and Şengün's not either, right? So you're going to have to kind of build, well, I mean, they have solid defenders, but I think you would have to acquire more defensive-minded guys if you're really going to make him a hub.
Yeah, it's just, Zion's not a great defender.
Nope.
And then, Queen, if he plays next to him, I mean, you have Misi, right? But like, you're not at a point where you're just like, well, all these guys are set, because even with Zion, right? Like he may be moved at some point in the future because they do have a new GM with Joe Dumars. So it's possible that something like that could happen. But again, I don't have an issue with the individual players. I like the individual players. I just don't know if I like them quite as much for New Orleans. And I don't like the idea of trading an unprotected first. But, if you want to play devil's advocate, if you're New Orleans, you could make the case, hey, if we're healthy, we could be a playoff team. And, if we are in the playoffs and these guys look good, then everybody else is going to look foolish. It's just, are you really going to be a playoff team? Because you'd have to bank on Zion being healthy in addition to his normal productivity. Like he can't miss, a bunch of games like he usually does. Then, DeJounte Murray, he's coming off the Achilles. You're waiting for him. You did get Jordan Poole, so maybe that kind of lessens some of that absence. But, again, that's the devil's advocate position. But I don't know if I would have done that personally. But, I guess you can see the vision for both of those individual players. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of this at all. I mean, go watch our live stream, please. Our reaction to this was kind of like, that was the first pick where I think, you and I were both like, weird pick with the fears one, that is, right? And I think I was super high on Queen coming into this draft, right? Like, I thought he could be top five talent, but I don't like where he landed, right? It's kind of like what you said during the live stream. You don't like, the full combination of all these guys. Like, yeah, individually, these players are awesome, right? Jeremiah Fears has tons of upside as a playmaker, ball handler, and, he can pass. It's just there's certain levels to his game that you also don't like, right? He's undersized, can't shoot as well, and turns the ball over a ton, right? For a guy who has the ball in his hands for 90% of the game. So there are questions in terms of that, right? And then also you just talked
Yeah.
about the questions about Derek Queen. And on top of that, the questions in New Orleans as well, right? In terms of health and how long is this Zion era truly going to last? So it really seemed like that they were drafting, with something in mind in terms of like a move. Even like one of our viewers, Untamed, shout out to him, he was talking about that. He was like, yeah, this seems like, a draft that they had where they're probably having like a trade in mind at some point, during like the deadline or something like that. But something's got to kind of go. But for me, I wouldn't grade that any higher than a C. There's no way.
Yeah, and then for the Nets, they also had some activity during the draft where in this case they ended up having 5 first round picks in the first round. Which is the most that a team has had. And they took basically 4 guards and a big, but pretty much all of them are guys that kind of ideally need the ball in their hand. They took at 8 Yegor Demin, right, who's kind of again another guy that I think a lot of people like, but I don't think anybody really liked him at 8. There were like a few people that were kind of leaning towards like, yeah, he might be top 10 talent, but most people feel like again, he's a tall, lanky guy that can handle the ball, that can pass, play in the pick and roll, but he can't really shoot, can't really defend, and he's not like a great finisher around the basket. So those 3 things, it's kind of a problem, right? It's kind of like with Fears where it's hard to be a small guard that doesn't shoot the ball that well. It's hard to be a tall ball handling guard that doesn't shoot the ball that well, nor can even finish that well, right? Like defensively, sometimes it's whatever because if you have good defensive players around them, maybe you can make up for that. But the other stuff is going to have to improve over time. And then, for some of their other picks, Nolan Traore, right? I mean, he's all right, but again, it's kind of a lot of the similar issues, I would say, right? And then moving on, Ben Saraf, he's a better shooter, I would say, than the other 2. But it's still, again, these are all kind of guys that like probably are in a similar tier. Then they also took Danny Wolf as well, right? Who's like a 7-foot point center type of player,
Yeah.
right? He played for Michigan. I don't know how much of that will translate to the league. But again, if he can pass and kind of make some additional plays with the ball, maybe it might work out. We'll see. We'll see how yeah, we'll see if that works out. And then they also took Drake Powell as well, right? Who's a UNC guard. So overall, didn't really like a lot of what they did. And you just kind of, if you're Brooklyn, I feel like ideally you wish that you could have actually gotten the top 5 pick, right? Because then you have a bunch of cap space. Maybe you could have used that in a trade for a star, or you could just get somebody better. But it just feels kind of tough to have all of those picks. But you could make the case, again, devil's advocate, take all these guys, throw darts on the board. At least one of them should work out right. That's kind of, I guess, the thought process there. But I didn't really like what they did too much.
Yeah, it reeked of bad desperation, right? Where it seemed like they probably got everybody that they wanted on their draft board, right? Like realistically within reach of these like of the ranges, right? But that's not necessarily a good thing because now you've got, like you said, 3 young guards who are kind of viewed as projects, I would say, right? Like Demon, like I guess it's kind of hard to pass on a guy who's 6'8" and plays the 1, like in theory, right? Because think about the
Right.
potential down the line, but also think about the bust potential, right? So I think that one's a risk. Nolan Traore, I mean, I like it, but at the same time, I hate it. You know what I mean? I think it's more so
Sure.
I like him as an individual, right? It kind of goes back to what we were talking about with New Orleans, but I don't like his fit on this team, right? So they're clearly scraping for something at the guard position, and I just don't really like how they kind of revealed their hand basically by drafting 3 point guards in one draft, and then obviously going with the other guys. I think the best pick that they had was probably Danny Wolf, if I'm going to be honest. Like that's the one that I like the most out of all of them.
And for that one, regardless, that pick was 27. So
Exactly.
like even if it doesn't work out that great, it's the 27th pick. So that's not as big of a deal
Sure.
as like the one that I think is the toughest one is Demeen because
I
that's
agree.
number 8,
Yeah.
right? That's and if some of the other guys who are still on the board, I would personally say they're better. But I guess if they like him, and like you said, it's hard to pass on a potential tall 6'8" ball handler. I guess because there are guys like that in the league who are really good at what they do. But I don't know. I don't know if he's going to be able to reach his ceiling. With some of these guys, again, it comes down to some of the jump shots, right? Because again, for him, if he can become a better shooter, that would help big time. Even if he's never like a great finisher, if he can at least have a jumper, then he can shoot over the top at 6'8". But you got to have at least one or the other of those two skill sets, I would say.
Yeah, I agree.
Then after that, right, Toronto, Colin Murray Boyles. I think that was a pick both you and I liked, right? He's a very versatile, switchable defensive guy. After they took him the next day or 2 days later, they fired Masai Ujiri. Guess we can potentially talk about that later.
Yeah.
But either way, I like that pick perfectly fine. Just again, fits in with what they want to do. Then you have Phoenix, right? Where this was Houston's pick. They took Kaman Malawak from Duke, right? Center. They didn't really have great center depth. Before this draft, they had Nick Richards and Oso Ighodaro, and that was pretty much it, right? And now you got Kaman Malawak. They also traded for Mark Williams, right? They didn't have to give up much to get him, right? It was the 29th pick and then a future first. Don't know what that'll look like. I guess his stock was just very low because of his injury. Feels like Charlotte was just trying to get rid of him, right? Like, because he was never really in rumors until we heard about the Laker deal, right? Where it was like, oh, Charlotte came to the Lakers and offered him.
Right.
So we'll see what happens with that. But for Malawak, right, he's got ton of length, ton of size, a lot of upside there, right? Potentially, especially potentially on the defensive end as well. So don't really have any issues with that. I think most of what Phoenix did in the draft was really good, right? Because they took Malawak, and then they also in the second round they ended up trading up in the second round to take a couple of guys, right? I believe they took Rasheer Fleming. I believe they also took Kobe Brea as well, right? So they ended up having, I think, some pretty good picks in the draft. We'll see what that looks like. Kobe Brea is a shooter, and then Rasheer Fleming's like a solid two-way big or forward from St. Joseph. Then we move on. Portland, right? So their draft was kind of funny, right? Where they took Cedric Coward and then they ended up trading him to Memphis for future picks, as well as they ended up trading down to 16, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Grizzlies took Cedric Coward, solid two-way forward, physical, strong, seemingly shot the ball pretty well in college. So we'll see, how that looks like in the NBA. But seems like a guy that wing-wise fits in pretty well. We knew going into last season, Memphis didn't really have a lot of great options in terms of wings, right? It was like they drafted Jalen Wells, right, last year as a rookie. Then they also had G.G. Jackson, who was coming off the foot injury. Then after that, Vince Williams, I guess, from VCU, but he's more like an undersized wing, right?
Yeah.
More like a 2-3.
Yeah.
So not really a ton of depth at the wing there, but now you have another guy who can slide in. Then you combine that, I guess, with KCP. And the other guys, we'll see if that can help out Memphis defensively, right? So I like that pick a lot for Memphis. And then Portland, by trading down, they made the biggest shocker of the draft in the first round by taking Hansen Yang, right, from China. And he's 7-foot big man. A lot of people have given him some Jokic comparisons. He's got this. He's got a couple of moves in the post, right? Like including a baseline spin move. He's also a pretty good passer. So there's potential for this to work out, for him to be a really solid, skilled big man that's got length. But then there's also the world where maybe it doesn't pan out, right? Because we've seen in the past some other bigs, right? The guy that I think the Kings took, right? It was Papagiannis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Georgios Papagiannis,
Mm-hmm.
guys like that. So all over the map. But neither you nor I had him projected this high in the draft. I had him like in the second round. But
Me too.
yeah, so we'll see. Portland clearly must think very highly of him. Now they have 4 centers on the roster, so we'll see what they do with that because they just took Klingon last year,
Yeah.
and then obviously they just took Yang, and then after that, then they still have Aiton and Robert Williams on the roster, right? We don't know what they're going to do with them. Then I think they also have Duop Reith, so I guess you could say 5 centers.
Yeah, if you want
So
to. Yeah.
yeah, then after that, right, Spurs took Carter Bryant, solid defensive-minded athletic forward. I think we both like that pick a
Mm-hmm.
ton. They don't really have a lot of wings on the roster. They like Devin Vassell is like a 2-3, Jeremy Sohan's like a 4-3, right? But this guy, is kind of like 3-4. So so that's not an archetype of players that they have on the roster a ton of. I guess maybe Keldon Johnson's the other one, but now he's a backup, doesn't seem like a future piece for the Spurs anymore.
Yeah, but this guy can
And then
guard 1 through 5. So
right. Then Oklahoma, yeah. So that's the lottery, right? Now I know Yang wasn't in the lottery, but it was tied to what Portland and the Grizzlies did. So after that, again, what other picks do you like? Because Thomas Sorber, big man from Georgetown, he went to Oklahoma City, big physical center who can run the floor. We'll see, what that looks like in Oklahoma City, right? Because they don't have a lot of those type of players. But it's no issue to have more big man depth, right? Because they have a lot of guys who are a little bit more undersized, even though they are physical and long. But now he's more like a classic, bigger physical big. So I like that pick a lot. And then I already mentioned with the Jazz, Walter Clayton. Heat took Kasparonis Yakashionis. Think most people like that pick. Solid guard. Again, how will that translate into the NBA? And then the Kings also traded into the draft and they took Neek Clifford, right? And again, I don't know as much about him. But I guess for the Kings, the fact that you were able to trade into the first round without having a first round pick, I think that's good for them, right? So hopefully he can come in and help them out at least somewhat. But what did you think of a lot of these other picks?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's like a ton to write home about in a lot of these areas, right? Like a lot of these guys are probably going to be serviceable role players with a little bit of upside, right, to become, potential starters for these teams and, fill in a certain kind of role, right? I actually really like the Jace Richardson pick for
Yeah,
Orlando, right?
Orlando.
It gives you, a little bit of some offensive creation outside of, your main guys. So he could be the spark plug, right? The Cole Anthony kind of replacement on top of, Desmond Bane, right? So you do have an offensive guard off the bench, still, right? And I think you'd probably want a guy with a little bit more upside like that versus Cole Anthony, where we kind of know that he's peaked at this point, right? So I do like that pick. I really like Liam McNeely to the Charlotte Hornets as well. I think that one's going to be really good because, he's a knockdown shooter. So you're kind of not necessarily being redundant in this draft, but I think you're doubling down on what you really want, right? You're surrounding LaMelo with guys who have a little bit of defensive potential, but also are certified bona fide shooters, right? So I think you're going to see a lot more finished plays, I think, in terms of what Charlotte's offense is going to look like. And maybe we'll see them, be a little bit better and more serious this year, hopefully, with barring injuries and whatnot. But yeah, in terms of the first round, I think those would be the other 2 picks that I really liked.
Yeah, so I guess if we want to talk about some of the teams in terms of what we liked, what they did, I think overall, obviously, some of the obvious ones are like Dallas. Of course, they got the number 1 pick.
Yeah.
They also took, I guess, Ryan Nemhard, right, as a two-way guy. So he went undrafted.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what he looks like, but I think that's a really good pickup if he can, if he can hang there. And then with the Spurs, in addition to Harper, they also took Carter Bryant. Love those 2 picks.
Yeah.
I think Philly did a good job with Edgecombe. We'll see what it looks like in terms of their rotation. And then for the Charlotte Hornets, I think all their picks, like you said, good, solid, professional players, right, that can come in and just fit and play a role, right? And I think, for Charlotte, they've kind of struggled with some of that, right? Because their picks have been all over the place, right, in terms of the last several years, right? Like last year, again, you don't like writing off guys after 1 year because you shouldn't do that, right? But unfortunately, it didn't seem like there were some games, but it felt like Salon's rookie year was a little bit underwhelming, right? Especially
Very.
yeah. So it felt like his especially because his stock rose a lot prior to the draft. So it felt like he was a little bit underwhelming. Not calling him a bust yet because it's just 1 year, right? I do have to be fair there, but I think you like that. think you have to like what the Wizards did as well, right? I think, you have to be pretty satisfied with the guys that they ended up taking. And then for the Jazz, to get a guy like Ace Bailey, who again is a polarizing guy, but we know that the best case scenario of him is a super talented player. And they don't really have a lot of those type of guys on the Jazz roster. That's one of the reasons why they're not very good as of right now, in my opinion. So I like that and the Clayton pick. And then after that, again, like I already mentioned with Phoenix, like that pick as well. I think they did a great job. The Hawks did a really good job because again, you took Asa Newell, right, who everybody liked as a solid forward, and then you were also able to get potentially, if New Orleans isn't very good next year, potentially another lottery pick. And we hadn't even mentioned it because the last time we recorded, right, that was coming off the finals, right? But Boston made multiple trades, right, to get out of the second apron, and one of those trades was sending Porzingis to the Hawks, right? So if he ends up panning out and being more available and productive compared to last season. Then you also combine getting that first from New Orleans and the guys they took. Like that could be a team that could be a real player in the Eastern Conference next season, right? They could be a potential conference finals group potentially. So I like a lot of what they did. But what do you think in terms of the teams that you like?
Yeah, I would probably say I obviously you got to give it to the Spurs. You got to give it to Dallas for sure, like you said. Um, I liked what Charlotte did. I know some people are like, "Nah, I don't really like it," but I love it. It shows me that they do have a clear sense of, yeah, we're sticking with LaMelo, we're sticking with Brandon Miller, and we're just banking on being healthy. And I think that's the right approach, right? Like they didn't really go for a guy like Ace Bailey or anything like that, and I really like that. You picking a guy who has a certain floor, but also does have a lot of potential, down the line to be a little bit more than just a knockdown shooter or a Swiss Army knife, right? Um, I really like Phoenix. I think that one was a really, really good draft. And, they did trade up to acquire Rasheer Fleming. So that's pretty dope, for them to, get him in the second round. Sneaky elite for sure. I honestly like what the Kings did too, like to get
Okay.
back into the first round, right? And
Yeah.
getting a guy like Neek Clifford, I think that's
Yeah.
super
Talk more
underrated.
about it.
Yeah, like Neek Clifford was super underrated. Like he's super versatile. They needed wings, right? And I think he's gonna fill that need because you're probably looking at Keegan Murray like, whoa, we don't know what you're gonna be down the line, but Neek Clifford, I think, is gonna be a huge upgrade. I think for them, much needed, right? Because they need as much help as they can get for sure. I think you like Utah because they did pick Ace Bailey, but that situation has kind of been like all over the place, right? With the potential holdout, right? If he doesn't show up by I think what Monday.
Yeah, he's supposed to show up on Saturday according to Draft Express.
Okay, good.
By
Well,
the time you watch this, he may have already shown up.
right. So situation somewhat pending, but I think getting Ace Bailey and getting a talent like that is pretty cool, and then also getting Walter Clayton Jr., who I think is probably going to be your insurance policy if Collier or um, Keontae George just kind of end up fizzling out and not really being what they were projected to really be. But yeah, overall, I think there were only like a couple teams that I really just didn't like. So overall, I
Right.
think everybody kind of gets a pat on the back for this one.
Right. Yeah, and like I already mentioned, in terms of some of the things I didn't like I said, didn't like as much of what New Orleans did, not in terms of the players, just in terms of I didn't like them picking those specific guys and giving up potential future draft assets. But again, I understand the thought process that maybe they think they'll be good next year because a couple seasons ago they won 48 games before Zion ended up getting hurt in the play-in, but that's your issue right there. And then for the Nets, again, a lot of picks, a lot of the same guys. Again, we'll see if any of them end up panning out, right? You don't want to necessarily automatically label them a loser. That's why I think we kind of more so talk about what we like and don't like, more so than winners, losers. But, you can say it's the same thing. What did you think of the Heat's pick, Kasparis Yakasionis? Because I think he's another guy where it seems like he seems to be a player that most people are in on, right? He was pretty good in college, and the Heat, by and large, have a pretty good track record in terms of the guys that they've picked up in the draft in the last several seasons.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can't really hate on the pick, right? Too much because you got him at 20. That's bang for your buck, right? Because a lot of people had him top 10 at certain points. I
Right.
was one
Yeah.
that had him, lottery, because I thought he was a lottery talent and he has lottery potential, right? But for him to go to Miami is best case scenario for him personally, right? Because think about it. You have a great coach in terms of, he knows how to get the best out of all these guys, right? And there's for sure a lot of upside, right? He can, he can pass, he can dribble, he's a point guard. There are the concerns of turning the ball over, but I think in a SPO system, you're probably not going to have the leeway to do that, right? And I think they're going to probably have him on a tighter leash. You're going to be surrounded by some pretty good offensive and defensive talent. So there is probably room for him to actually have a serious rotational role this year. And I think it's great. I really wouldn't grade it like below a B if you want me to be real.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and again, I guess questions about the athleticism, will that translate over into the NBA? But yeah, like I said, I think Miami usually does benefit out in terms of the guys that they end up drafting because, like I said, they have a pretty decent draft record, including guys that people, like you said, this is different because people had him mocked relatively high, so they feel like he might have fallen. But just as a whole, they do a good job of this. Um, Moving on into the second round. Which guys did you like in terms
Mm.
of a lot of the second round picks?
Yeah. Um, I would probably go with I really like Rasheer Fleming. I think that one for
Yeah,
sure is a big one,
right.
right? I actually like Janai Broom going to
For
Philly.
Philly.
Going to Philly.
Yeah,
Like,
for sure.
and I'm not like a big Broom fan, not a big advocate, right? I mean, like
Mhm.
he's all right. Like, I think a lot of his dominance in college was due to his age and experience, and that's fine. But I think in the NBA, right, he's going to have a solid role being, a backup big for Philly, right? And I think Philly,
Mhm.
acquiring a lot of depth pieces, I think is pretty cool, right? Because even VJ Edgecombe being a top 3 pick, we have to be realistic. He's probably going to be a depth piece, but it's a young depth piece that has potential to be a star. So it's really cool what Philly think what Philly did, this draft. So I would say Janai Broom for sure. I think
Mhm.
Cam Jones going to Indiana is pretty good, right? You can't really knock them for doubling down on a lot of their depth. So there looks like they're trying to stock up on some more guys that they can just kind of pull out of nowhere. I'm trying to think of who else I like in the second round. Oh, I like Cleveland at 49
Tyrese Proctor.
picking Tyrese
Yeah,
Proctor. I think
from
that's a
Duke.
steal,
Yep.
right? Like a lot of people had him late first round, but to get him at 49 I think is a pretty good steal for sure. Um I yeah, I think that was a good one. Yeah, that's probably about it for me. I mean, like a lot of the second round guys I think outside of those might not even play.
What did you think of Amari Williams going to Boston? Because it seems like that's a guy that's got a decent amount of versatility at the center spot. And maybe that could be a guy that comes in and, probably like you said, doesn't play a ton, but maybe it's like Porzingis is gone, although he doesn't play consistently anyways, but still,
Yeah,
like he's gone. I'm gonna assume they're gonna bring Cornette back. I don't know at what dollar amount, but I'm
right.
going to assume that they're gonna bring him back. Horford, I don't know, right? I
Mhm.
mean, you would think that they probably bring him back, but maybe somebody pays him X amount, although there's not a lot of teams with cap space. But either way, like there's minutes to go around for the center spot. So he could be a guy in theory that could end up playing his way into the rotation. Maybe, I don't know. Like, is he a Missoula guy? We'll see. But what'd you think of him?
Yeah, I think it's a good one. Because think about it, right? All he really has to do, realistically, is be more serviceable than Luke Cornett. And I think that's doable for him, right? Like you said, he's got some upside for sure. He's 6'10. He's, older, because he is a senior. So it's not like, we're talking about, a raw 19-year-old freshman, right? So he has some experience. And I think, coming from Kentucky and being a senior, I think does add a certain level of experience that I think Boston was probably looking for, coming off of a slight retool rebuild.
Okay. Yeah, and then I guess just a last couple of names before, we kind of finish up the draft
Mhm.
talk. What'd you think of Elijah Martin And then what did you think of Adu Thiero?
Yeah, I think Elijah Martin has potential, right?
Mhm.
Um, I mean, it's not the best thing in the world, but it's by far not the worst thing, right? I think
Okay.
they could have gone a different route, but at the same time, it's good. I don't think you can really hate on it, right? Like there's no clear negative that drags it, I think, below like a B.
Mhm.
And who was the
Okay.
other one?
The Lakers, yeah, because I guess we might as well, since these are teams that everybody talks about, we can mention Lakers and Warriors picks.
Okay.
Warriors, I think, took two guys. One of
Yeah.
them I don't think will play a whole lot, Alex Toohey.
Yeah.
So we don't have to mention him as much, but we can mention Will Richard, right, who was on the Florida team that
Mhm.
I think won it all,
Mhm.
and then Adu Thiero, right,
Okay, yeah, that's who it was.
who was out of I think Arkansas.
Yeah, I'll start with the Lakers pick. Super
Okay.
underrated, right? I know they did trade their way into the draft. I think
Yeah.
at what 36 or whatever.
They started at 55, then they traded up to 45, right? Because they traded the 55th pick in cash to the Bulls. Then they traded up again to 36.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, this guy is arguably top 3 athletes in this entire draft. So you got a freaking freak athlete, low key. I like that already.
Yeah,
The 3-point shooting
right.
is the question
That's the
mark,
question.
but
That's the
the
question.
potential is there. Because physical tools all there, and we already know defensive upside is there as well. So I think this is a good rotational guy, right? It's good depth, but he has potential to make a huge splash if he can get that jumper together.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I guess before we mentioned Will Richard, we just got a notification from Shams Charania that it looks like Nas Reed will be re-signing with the Minnesota Timberwolves, 5 years, 125 million. So
There
I
we
think
go.
we both expected him to go back to Minnesota. I didn't know what the contract number would be, in fairness, right? 5 years, 125. I mean, I guess basically 25 million a year, right? So solid number, solid contract for him.
Yeah. I think that's a
Yeah,
steal. That's a best of both
yeah,
worlds. I think, for the
right.
team, right? It doesn't put you in a hole. And also Nas Reed is getting paid for his role. So I mean, hey, you can't hate on that. What did you think of their draft, Minnesota? Because it is
Yeah,
interesting because they did draft 2 big men, 2
right.
centers.
Yeah,
One of them seven
yeah,
three, who might not play.
right. Yeah, so Rocky Zakarski, that's the Australian guy. I think I'm going to assume that he may not play. I think he's the one that probably doesn't play.
Yeah.
And then the other guy that they took was in that was the first round, right? Or was
Yeah.
that the
It
second
was
round?
the first round pick, number 17.
Yeah, so yeah, Joan Behringer,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So again, I mean, the thing is with Minnesota is because of the fact that they're in that spot where once they bring back, they've already brought back Nas Reed. So once they presumably bring back Julius Randle, assuming they do, right? That's going to continue to be a really expensive roster. So you do have to find some ways in the draft to kind of help out and continue to build the roster. And Gobert at his age, right? How many more high level seasons is he going to give you? So I don't have a problem with them drafting bigs in the draft. Like I said, don't know if they're going to be both playable right out of the gates, but neither guy, anyways, will probably play much during the season, regardless, right? Because you're going to have Gobert. Obviously, they just re-signed Nas Reed, so he's going to be back. And I'm going to assume they bring back Randall, unless something crazy happens that I don't expect. So they probably won't play a whole lot anyways. I mean, if I had to guess, Behringer probably would be the first one that would come in and get minutes. He's the higher pick. I think he's the one that's looked at as being more ready to contribute,
Hmm.
right? Good athlete and all that. But yeah, I don't really have a problem with what they did because I guess the question is like, what else realistically could they have? I mean, because they have a couple other guys that they've drafted that don't even play. So like, you would like to see if those guys, like what was it, Jalen Clark,
Hmm.
who didn't really play a ton last year, but he played somewhat,
Hmm.
and then Terrence Shannon Jr. they just took last year. So like, they already have like a
I
decent
agree.
collection
Yeah.
of like guard 2 threes and whatnot. I guess the only other position maybe you might think of is point guard, but regardless, like I don't have a problem with what they did.
Yeah, I think they did a good job for sure. Because I'm sure they probably had their eye on Sorber, like a lot of teams outside of the lottery did. And clearly, I think they got, I think, the next best thing in terms of a big man as of right now with
Yeah,
Behringer for
exactly.
sure.
Yeah, and then I guess just because we were talking about that, back to I guess Will Richard. Do you
Yeah.
think he can do anything for Golden State?
Um, I think he can give you some creation and some sense off the bench, right? Because I think there were times where you kind of looked at Golden State and they didn't really have much of an offense if Steph wasn't out there, right? And Jimmy as well. So the non-Steph and non-Jimmy minutes were really really crucial in the playoffs, and it definitely came back to bite them in the butt because they barely scraped by against Houston, right? You were kind of backpacked by some very very timely Steph buckets, so. Um, shout out to them for I think kind of running. It seems like they're pretty committed to running it back, right? But you're just adding another depth piece that was much needed, and he could have like a similar role to what McConnell kind of had this year, in the postseason. Maybe down the line, obviously, because he's a rookie, but I think that's kind of what they're going for here.
Yeah. So yeah, and again, like those, that's pretty much most of the draft in a nutshell. Again, I didn't watch the broadcast of it because when we were live streaming, I had the feed of the draft on X, so I didn't really have a spot where I was looking at the broadcast. I know a lot of people, had thoughts about it, but
Yeah,
I guess it is what it is. But either way, yeah, the 2025 draft is come and gone. So now we move on into the next stage of the offseason, which is free agency. I guess now the thing here with the free agency this time around is you don't really have a ton of great players out there, right? Like we have in previous years, right? It's a lot of guys that are more so role players. I think a lot of these guys, not all of them, but several of them, I'm not going to be surprised if they just go back and re-sign with their teams. Like we already saw Kyrie Irving re-sign. We already saw Fred VanVleet re-sign. He actually took a little bit less, right? Which gives them more flexibility to have the full MLE, and then they can use that to either grab somebody nice in free agency or maybe trade. Before we got on, Philly re-signed Justin Edwards, and then after that, like I said, a lot of these guys, like I expect LeBron to go back to LA. I expect Harden to be return as a Clipper, and then I expect Randall to come back as a Minnesota Timberwolf. After that, a lot of these other guys probably won't get a ton of money, and then it's just dependent on how much are they going to get, what is their role, where are they going to go. Like Brook Lopez, does he go back to Milwaukee, or does he leave and go somewhere else that can give him, I don't know, something else? They have his bird right, so they can, in theory, give him the most, but how much are they willing to give him? I don't know. Clint Capella, now that you got Porzingis, he's probably out of there. It's just the question is, I guess if he wasn't happy about losing his starting spot, he must want to still be a starter. So how many spaces can he go to where he's the starting center? If he is your starting center, how good are you? Depending on the rest of your roster. And then after that, it's mostly role players, right? Like Miles Turner is the other guy who I think will probably go back to his previous spot. I expect Dorian Finney-Smith to do the same. But the rest of them, like I said, are mainly role players. So last year, I think, and the year before, we kind of did a free agency primer where we kind of talked about where a lot of these guys go. I don't feel like we really have to do that this time. So I think after, and then like I said, I already mentioned Nasri just re-signed. So after that, then it's up to the trade market. And we did have a few trades that occurred since the last time we met. We had Drew Holiday going to Portland for Anthony Simons, right? And I believe Boston also got a couple of seconds as well. And then you also had Boston trade Porzingis. This was a 3-team deal, right? Porzingis goes to Atlanta, Terrence Mann goes to Brooklyn, and then Georges Niang goes from Atlanta to Boston. So they ended up getting under the tax, or under the second apron, excuse me. So they end up saving a ton of money. And they still say that more moves could potentially be on the way. Then we had that third trade, right, with Jordan Poole going to New Orleans, right? And then CJ McCollum and Kelly Olynyk head over to Washington. So Washington gets to be able to have expiring money. At the end of next season, they'll have over 100 million in cap space open. See what they do with it. Maybe trade, maybe overpaying veteran players or something like in the next offseason. I don't know, like a la Houston or something different. I don't know. But what'd you think of all those deals?
Yeah, I mean every trade that you kind of just mentioned, it's wild, right? Because it kind of was a domino effect. It started with Desmond Bain way back, and then it kind of tumbleweeded into KD, and now we have all this other stuff with like Porzingis being moved, Drew Holiday being moved as well. Like I think in terms of like what Boston did, it's good, right? Because they knew that they weren't really going to contend, and some of these guys needed to be moved on from, right? You don't really need it to move on from a guy like Jaylen Brown because realistically, what does that haul look like, right? So, you were able to get back a decent score with Simons, and then also with sending Porzingis to Atlanta. That's kind of really just getting rid of a guy who didn't really give you a whole lot this year or, well, last year. And his health, I think, definitely impacted the way that they looked for sure, especially down the stretch and into the postseason. So I'm not really too mad at it. I'm pretty impressed that they were able to get off of all those contracts and actually acquire a guy like Simons in return.
Yeah.
And then I think the one that I do want to talk about is the Wizards one for sure. At the time when the trade first happened, I was like, WTF, because I thought we could get a first round pick for Jordan Poole or hold on to him for a little bit longer and rehab his value even more, because his value was definitely rehab compared to last year, right? And there's no doubt about that. But shout out to Will Dawkins, man, because he's really, taken every bad contract that we had, previously and turned it into better bad contracts. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but think about all the money that's being freed up, right? You're not committing money to Kuzma anymore. You're committing it to Chris Middleton, who's probably a more suitable vet for, the guys that are on this roster, right? Same thing with Jordan Poole. You're not committing, that kind of money to Jordan Poole. You're committing it to a guy like CJ McCollum, who could teach, a lot of these guys, tons of things like Bub and Trey Johnson now, right? So there's a level of seriousness that I haven't seen with the Wizards in a very long time, and I like that. But obviously, these moves aren't even for the here and now; they're for the future, right? Like you already talked about. They're going to have so much money down the line where there could be some serious there could be a serious approach in terms of like, yeah, look at what the route that Detroit took. They had all these guys come in, and yeah, in theory, like you're like, well, why sign all these role players? But look at the impact, right? There wasn't that level of seriousness within that organization. It was just a bunch of young guys trying to play ball, and they were sucking every single year, even though you had Cade. But if you surround, a lot of these young guys with some, solid role players, I think, you're going to see a difference in the organization. And I'm really hyped for the future off of just kind of moving on from a little bit of a weird era.
Yeah, exactly. So and that's kind of how you have to look at it, right? With a lot of these teams, I guess. The thing is that I think we probably have to assume that because the free agency options are not necessarily the best, not that they're horrible, right? But there's no real stars necessarily in free agency, right? It's a lot of role players that could make a difference for some of these teams. But then after that, like you're going to have to probably operate, like I said, through the trade market. So I guess the question is that when you move into free agency, there are a lot of teams that I think you're going to have to look at it from the perspective of like, okay, what can we really do to improve this roster through the trades, and what guys are out there that can really help us. So, which teams are you kind of eyeing where you're not going to be surprised if they end up making, some type of significant move? It doesn't necessarily have to be like a superstar, but just something that clearly alters the shape of their roster in a way that's going to presumably make them better. I guess for some of them, maybe worse if they decide to blow it up or tear it down or something. But what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of weird. Because I mean, you already talked about like the some of the free agents, right? And with Nasri coming off the board, I think that kind of will kickstart a lot more of guys re-signing and stuff like that. But one team I do have my eye on is Dallas, right?
Mhm.
I'm interested what they do because I think they do need to find some sort of Kyrie replacement, right? In term, just for the time being, for while he is out, right? I know a lot of people have talked about Chris Paul potentially going there. That could be,
D'Lo.
yeah, D'Lo. That could be interesting, right? So I think you're probably going to see them potentially do something. I think Cleveland is another one. Do they bring back Ty Jerome potentially? Not sure.
Mhm.
Uh, what do you think about like Detroit? Do you think Detroit should do anything because I think Schroeder and Malik Beasley, right? Are
Yeah, I think there's been talks about Dennis Schroeder may go to a team like Sacramento because they don't really have a point guard
right,
basically at all, right?
right.
Because like Zach Levine and Malik Monk are more like combo guards. They're
Yep.
not really point guards.
Yeah.
And then after that, the other quote unquote point guards on the roster, I guess, would be
Devin Carter.
uh, yeah, Devin Carter, who they just drafted, who we didn't see a whole lot of
Yep.
last year because he was hurt.
Yep.
And even though he played, he still looks kind of raw. Doesn't
Very.
really look quite, yeah, he doesn't really look quite ready to assume the role of starting point guard.
Hmm.
And then you have Keon Ellis, who's more like a 3-and-D guard. He's not really like, he's not really a point guard either.
Yeah.
So that's so Detroit might lose one of those two guys. I don't know. Like Shooter might be more likely just because I could see, like a MLE type of thing for Dennis Schroeder. I doubt Detroit does anything significant only
Yeah.
because, again, who else is now available that you can really trade for off the board, right? It's probably just internal development, continue to bring in a few veterans, right, that are willing to come in and play a role, and then, get Jaden Ivey back. Hopefully he stays healthy and continues to improve. Maybe Cade continues to improve and go up another level. And he was already great last year. And then some of the other guys like Asor Thompson or Jalen Duren, right? Just kind of hope that those guys continue to improve. I doubt that they do a ton.
Yeah.
And then I guess, what about, again, I know we keep coming back to these teams. But I guess we can probably start. Well, let's start with this one player before we go into the teams. Russell Westbrook, do we think he goes back to Denver? I guess is the main, because the Kings were another team where like it came up where like maybe they're interested in signing Russell Westbrook because he declined his player option. Not like it was a lot of money. I think it was like 3-4 million. So basically kind of like a minimum contract. I don't think they've completely ruled out that he can come back to Denver, but I guess the question is, do you think he will be back in Denver next season or does he go elsewhere?
I think he goes elsewhere. Um, realistically, yeah, I think he does actually fit what they wanted to do. Right, I think the proof was in the pudding, especially later in the year because at the start of the year, yeah, it was abysmal, but it looked pretty good even throughout the postseason. Like he had some masterclass games, that kept them around, especially going into the postseason and the postseason as well. So I would like him to stay, but I think he's probably going to end up walking. I just don't really foresee a future there.
Yeah, because I mean, he's probably not going to get a ton of money, so he can pretty much go anywhere he wants. It's
Exactly.
just for Denver, he was a pretty big part of their regular season
Hmm.
and postseason success. So if they were to lose him, that'd be kind of difficult. You'd kind of have to maybe either replace him with another minimum contract point guard that maybe is similar, or you just have to hope and pray for, again, internal development. Maybe Jalen Pickett, right? Maybe he ends up being a little bit better next year. I don't know. So that's kind of a weird situation to be in. But I guess, if we're looking at some other teams, around the league, right? I guess in terms of trade, like, do we think the Knicks stand pat and just kind of hire a new coach?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean,
Mhm.
realistically, their hands are tied, right? Look at all the guys who have been traded, right? Like I know there was, serious buzz about KD going to New York. That didn't happen, right? So I feel like they're probably, stuck. And it's not bad because they were a good team this year. But I just don't
Really
think,
good.
yeah, exactly. I don't think that they're going to be able to do much. They're probably just going to have to bank on more chemistry, more time together, and even potentially a better system, right?
Yeah. And some of these teams may also just be waiting for maybe he doesn't do anything now, but maybe down the line, maybe Giannis could be available
Sure.
later in the season or
Yeah,
something
like a
like that. Who
deadline
knows?
thing, right? A big
Yeah,
deadline
like a
thing.
deadline thing,
What do you
possibly.
what do you think about Kaminga? I think that's a situation that people
Yeah,
have
so that's
kind of
another
like
guy.
been monitoring.
Yeah, so that's another guy that I was kind of interested in discussing
Hmm.
because he's, I guess, a restricted free agent.
Hmm.
And then the question is, does Golden State re-sign him and give him whatever the money is? It's probably below what he would like, but it's better than nothing because there's not a lot of teams with cap space. And I don't believe that Brooklyn, who has a lot of cap space, I don't believe that they're going to just use most of their cap space on him. I don't think they'll do that. Maybe they do, but I don't think they would.
Yeah.
But either way, I guess that's the question. Because if you're Golden State, right, and you bring him back, well, it's not that he's a bad player, but it just seems like they don't really value a ton of what he does, right? And like the things that they need him to do. It's just there's kind of a clash of the player he feels like he is different from the player that Golden State wants him, or I guess in theory needs him to be, right? Like we know he can put up points. We know he's a great athlete, but Golden State, it seems like kind of would prefer him to be more of like a versatile all-around guy, and he hasn't really shown enough of that consistently, right? And that's kind of the question of plus with Golden State, then you run into the issue of if you pay him a decent amount of money, then you have the issue of you got four guys making a ton of money. Three of them are 35 plus. And where does that really get you? Like they could still be a 50 win team or somewhere around that, but probably not quite good enough to be a championship team. Again, there's nothing wrong with being in that tier. But, again, I'm sure the fans would probably prefer them to move up a tier closer. I don't know how realistic that could be. But I also think it's probably not Kuminga, right? You probably would prefer somebody who's just a better fit, even if the talent is not a bad basketball player. I don't know what they're going to do with him. It wouldn't shock me if they just re-signed him to an okay deal and they just keep him around until they find a deal that they like and then eventually trade him later. There are teams that have been interested. There's been talks about Miami apparently is very interested in him. So maybe that if it's a sign and trade, that could be the team. I don't know, what the offer would be. I mean, I'm sure Warriors fans are probably like, give us back Wiggins, right? But yeah, maybe they want to do that. I don't know. But outside of that, I don't know what else Golden State would want. Duncan Robinson, I guess maybe as a shooter. But what do you think? I mean, do you think he just resigns and is in Golden State maybe until closer to the deadline? Or is it just, or does he get a sign and trade? Or maybe he just stays and they just try to find a way to make it work.
Well, I can tell you what's not going to happen. He's not going anywhere for nothing, right? He's not going to walk for nothing.
Right.
So something's going to happen. It's kind of scary to think about because, like you said, a lot of teams don't have a crazy amount of cap space. So I doubt there's another team that would offer, a decent amount more than what Golden State is going to put on the table, right? So
Right.
I think he has no leverage in this situation, unfortunately, right? It's pretty much the Warriors or nothing. But like you said, the sign and trade aspect for sure could be a thing, right? If not necessarily a bargain deal, but like you said, a number that's lower than his expectation, but somewhere else, that could be beneficial for him, to kind of blossom into the player that I think you and I both know that he could have been if he wasn't on Golden State.
Yeah. And there's a couple. I think the Kings were also a team that's been mentioned, right? Potentially as a guy. I mean, they're looking for literally anyone and everyone. But either way, again for Golden State, it comes down to how much are you willing to pay him? Does he want to stay there? What's the other offers out there? What could you get back if you trade him? Because there could be guys like where it's like again, maybe their quote unquote ceiling isn't Kuminga level, but it's just a much higher floor, and it's not like the ceiling is low.
Right.
So, and it's just like I said, probably somebody that's a better fit, more willing 3-point shooter, right? Probably a little bit better at attacking and passing and kicking out in terms of closeouts. Just again, the typical type of Golden State Warrior player that we all kind of have a decent understanding at this point.
Sure thing.
Of what they would want it to be. I guess if I'm gonna make a prediction, I don't know. I mean, like that's kind of a tough one, but it wouldn't shock me, like I said, if they just ended up kind of just signing him to relatively whatever deal, and then they just have to hang on to them until they find a deal they like. But what do you think?
Yeah,
you think he's gone? Do you think it's just a sign and trade?
I think it would be a straight up sign and trade.
Okay.
I think there's no trust. There's no mutual trust between the two, right? Like these guys, Steve Kerr, and Kuminga pretty much take shots at each other anytime the other is brought up, right? The proof is in the pudding in terms of the minutes, the rotation, everything, right? And even his lack of effort to be a little bit more than the athletic guy on the team, right? So I think he's checked out. Golden State is probably like, well, I mean, we'll give you the number, but you're not going to like it. So I think sign and trade is for me.
Right. For them, you got to be more than just that guy. You got to be another guy.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I guess the question, So I guess the question is, for Kuminga, wherever he goes, right? Like if you're the Heat, like say you're the Miami Heat, like are you going out of your way to get him in a sign and trade? Is that the type of player you'd be interested in?
Big time, man. Think about it, right? You
Mm-hmm.
you just drafted Kasparis Jakuzonis. Cool. That's great. You have young talent. Hero's not old. Bam is not old, right?
Yeah,
In theory, right, Kuminga can be exactly like Wiggins. He's younger, right? So I think they should prioritize youth coming off of the Jimmy Butler trade and era, right?
yeah,
So yeah, just continue to, if I'm Miami, continue to look at acquiring a lot of guys with potential, high upside, right? And Kuminga does have
yeah.
upside. Like you can't ignore that, right? No matter
Mm,
what. So we'll see what happens. But if I'm Miami, I'm greenlighting that pretty much instantly.
yeah.
However, I know
But
Pat Riley's on the stingier side of things, so that might not even be ultra realistic.
yeah. So you think more than likely he ends up getting moved.
Yes.
Okay. And then Miles Turner, we already talked about. I think he ends up just going back to Indiana. No real
Mm.
questions or concerns there. I guess for Boston, we already mentioned that they made the two deals with Holiday and Porzingis. Do we think that other guys will get moved? Like, do you think that there's a potential for any of the other core guys? Like, I think maybe the most likely next guys could be like a Sam Hauser, just because, he's got a relatively whatever contract. And I'm sure a bunch of teams could talk themselves into using a guy like that, right? Who's just like a 3-point shooter, you know, can compete on the defensive end, even though he's not an elite defender. But that might be, I think, a little bit more likely than White or Brown. But again, I suppose if a team comes to them with a really good offer, a la what happened with Desmond Bain, I don't think it'd be a shocker if Boston does it. My only question and concern is that if you completely tear it down, okay, well, by the time Jason Tatum comes back, what do you have? You don't really have much.
Right.
So I would be a little bit more surprised if White or Brown got moved. I think it would be more so, like I said, some of the other guys on the roster.
Yeah, I
But
would
maybe
agree
you
with
think,
that. I would agree with that.
okay,
Like, I don't think your stars are gonna get moved, right? But it wouldn't surprise me if, I don't know, Al Horford or
free agent,
well,
so he
that
can
too.
just
Yeah,
walk.
yeah, he could just walk in all reality. But um, yeah, like you said, Sam Hauser, guys like that. And I think Cornette is a free agent too, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken. So
he is.
a lot of these guys might not even end up coming back anyway. So we'll see. But yeah, I think them trading core rotational guys already signifies that they're kind of checking out on that.
Yeah. Then I guess couple other I guess Milwaukee, what do we expect out of them? Do we expect them to be able to kind of pull anything together? I would say no.
No,
I
their
like
hands are tied. Look at their
yeah. Yeah.
situation monetarily. They're pretty much going to run it back, play, and cruise with off the coattails of Giannis. But who
Yeah.
knows? That might not even last past the deadline.
Yeah. Then Phoenix, do we assume that they move Jalen Green? Like it wouldn't surprise me if they just kept him. Like, cause I mean, like, the other stuff that they've grabbed in the draft and the bigs, like that's helpful. There still probably won't be that great of a team. But, at least now, like there's a okay, better foundation to work with. Like I don't feel like they have to move Jalen Green. But what do you think?
Um, I mean, in my opinion, I think you should look at moving either Jalen
Yeah,
Green
he's
or
not untouchable.
yeah, you should be moving Jalen Green and Bradley Beal. At least
Yeah,
trying to 24/7, right?
yeah.
Like I think they did
They
a
want the
great
deal
job.
though.
I think they did a great job in the draft, right? They did a good job of getting wings and big men. Great. And
Hmm.
that and a lot of depth and youth, right? And that's what you really need around Book. You need all those kinds of players that you drafted, right? So continue to go out and get those guys via trades. There's somebody out there that would probably take on, Jalen Green's contract for sure because it's not, a horrible contract by any means, right? It's actually, a little bit more team friendly, but however, it's a matter of, matching the salary a little bit. So that's where I'd be like, I don't know how likely it is that that happens, right? It is tough because I know you were talking about on the live stream, right? Like the trade finder is not your friend right now in terms of finding a Jalen
Right.
Green trade, and it's definitely not going to be your friend if you're trying to find a Bradley Beal trade. So
No.
they like you said they might just have to run it, but they should do everything in their power to move those guys, right? At least one of them.
Right. Then I guess last but not least, a couple other teams just to kind of check in on. I suppose. I guess so. The Denver Nuggets, they got their new GM. I guess right. And then they got a new assistant as well. Do we expect any real movement from them? Like, do we think that there's a potential for any of the non Jokic Murray guys to get moved? Or do we think that they're just probably going to run it back and just kind of maybe fill in the holes and gaps with whatever they can scrape up in free agency?
I think Michael Porter Jr. is probably on the chopping block this time around this year. Because I don't think they can afford to have another season like they did this year and kind of be scrambling to do potentially something at the deadline, right? Especially if they lose out on a Russell Westbrook. So they're probably going to need to break down that Michael Porter Jr. contract into maybe some more valuable bench players or, starters as well. So, because clearly Peyton Watson isn't reliable enough. Michael Porter Jr. himself isn't even, I think, reliable enough on both ends of the floor at this point. So, I feel like he's somewhat holding that team back in terms of what they can realistically do.
Yeah. I guess the thing is that for Denver, they did get to the second round and they lost to Oklahoma City in 7 games. So they could talk themselves into the idea of like, we're close. We just need to be healthy and maybe improve around the margins. I'd say that's probably how they should look at it. Like, I don't know if they have to do anything completely drastic. And then last but not least, Lakers need a center. There's been talks about, I guess, Wiggins, I suppose, right? Where it's kind of the idea of some type of framework comes from Anthony Irwin as well as some others, right? Some type of framework centered around the idea of like Rui plus something, right? For Wiggins. Miami supposedly wants a first back, maybe Dalton Connect as well. It's just a matter of like, do they actually do it? But I guess the main question for them is, would you prioritize getting a center or getting a wing? And like, which one do we even think that they'll get?
A center. I think there's no question about it. You need to find a center, right? Like it's clear. Who Jackson Hayes? I doubt he comes back. He could go somewhere else, right? Who's the other guy on the roster? Alex Len. Yeah.
He might be out of the league.
That's my point. So there's going to be a clear vacancy at center. So you have to do something, right? I think you should package a little bit of your core, right? And just move them to get Luka his 5, because I think once you get Luka his 5, the other things will fall into place, right? And I'm sure they'll have a very good deadline as they normally do. So yeah, I think they can really play things by ear after they address the big man problem. I think wing should be second.
Yeah. So I guess, do we have a prediction? Do we have an idea for it's opening night? Who's the starting center?
No clue. It could be Casper for all I care. But yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, like you could realistically say anybody, who makes like a decent chunk of change, right, to match the salaries that you were talking about, right? But if we're talking about like a haul of Rui, Connect, and a first, I'm expecting like elite play, right? Like not like top tier, but elite in terms of, this guy is a bona fide starter, and having him at the 5 is going to help us get to the playoffs again and be better than a first round exit. Got it?
So would you do the Wiggins deal, I guess is the question. Would you go out and get him?
I don't know, man.
Because I think the question is there a way where you could do that and then get some other center that maybe isn't amazing, but then like is not like a minimum contract player? I think that's the question.
Yeah,
that's what people are.
I mean, I understand the logic, because I think Wiggins is phenomenal, right? Look at the things that he's been able to do, throughout his career, and really the latter end, right, where he's like this elite 2-way guy who can also knock down shots, right? So,
right,
I don't know. It's interesting. It's very interesting. I think there's room for them to take either route, but who knows?
Right. Yeah, that's the question.
Who knows what they do?
Like you said, they probably do something.
Right.
I'm skeptical though that it's going to be something amazing.
Sure.
I guess is the question. Maybe that's just like the quote unquote pessimist, but I just don't know if they're going to be willing to give up X amount of stuff or whatever to go get the big. I don't know, because the question is like, which players do they like? Which ones are available? What's the package that they have to offer? Because in terms of the assets, they'd have to be willing to give up, more than probably like just one guy, right? It would
Yeah,
have to be, a couple pieces on the roster. Some of these guys, the nice thing is a lot of them are expiring deals. So you might be able to pour some of them together. But I do agree, like if you're also putting Connect in at first, then I think it needs to be better than Wigan, personally, in my opinion.
I agree.
I think that's too much,
I agree with you.
right? If you're Yeah, and that's the question I would have
Yeah,
for them. And like you said, I don't have a prediction for who their starting center is going to be, but if you told me it was Clint Capella, it wouldn't be a shocker or a surprise. It's just the question is that ideal? No, but I could see them going for a stopgap option, potentially.
yeah,
Yeah, so in terms of news rumors, again, that's most of what we've been talking about because we're talking about free agency. The free agency moratorium period begins June 30th. So that'll be Monday. I believe it's at 6 p.m. So, keep your eye out on all that. We'll see what we do. Regardless, we'll have an episode at some point about it. Again, not a lot of superstars in free agency. Of course, there are guys like LeBron and Harden. I think they'll go back to their teams, and when they come back, obviously people will be talking about it, including us. But again, if you want to join on these polls that we do on IG, of course, go on at the OBT podcast on Instagram. If you leave a comment on any of our socials, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and X, all at the OBT podcast, we'll pick one and we'll read it. And then, of course, continue to like and subscribe to help our channel grow. We've gotten several subs over the last few weeks from the content, so that means we're doing something right. So hopefully we can continue to do that. Look out for Summer League as well. That'll obviously be fun. Everybody will be watching it. We appreciate all the support. We'll see you next episode.